You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with my husband, Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Here is episode 130, Water, Freezing Pipes, and Mold. Before we get started on this episode, a short or not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed herein. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 20 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all solo podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon about mold and dealing with mold in your home at amazon.com/author/Steve Worsley. And if you're interested in scheduling a mold consultation, over the phone consultation with Steve, you can be sure to find out more about those and his availability at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode. Hello, welcome to a brand new episode of the Toxic Mold Podcast. Steve, yesterday was Halloween.
Yep. October just came and went, kind of like fall.
Yeah, fall doesn't exist here. So in Wyoming, there's no fall. But yeah, it came and went, and it wasn't, I don't know, we don't get trick-or-treaters where we live, so it's kind
No, you'd have to drive around on a side-by-side or something, so it's kind of nice. I mean, we don't have to worry about that. We can just buy candy if we feel like eating it. And then wonder why we get cavities.
Yeah, that's very, very, very true. Well, let's talk about water and pipes freezing and mold. What do you want to say about all that?
So this is the main reason for this topic. We've gone over the fall checklist. We obviously live somewhere where it gets pretty cold. Any of our listeners that live somewhere where it freezes, which I'm sure, I have clients that live in Arizona or Georgia where it doesn't freeze, but I have clients up in Alaska, so I have clients over in India, and so my point is this is more or less based around pipes freezing, but it's also based on just leaving water trickle or having a little trickle that you don't address. Let's say with a kitchen sink, a stem washer's bad, so the water just sits there and trickles. Well, for a stem washer, it's not expensive to fix that, but if you're leaving it trickling because it's supposed to drop down to -10 tonight, we want to just talk about the problems it can cause, and especially a lot of people do it when they're leaving for the weekend or whatever reasons.
And what's the thinking behind that? Because I'd never really heard that till you explained to me, leaving the water trickling
to keep the water moving,
so pipes don't freeze.
Exactly.
Is that right? Okay. And does that actually work?
Well, I mean, theoretically, yeah. It's no different than skiing over a cliff face. I mean, if you land it right, it'll work. But the risk's obviously a lot higher for that. But there's a lot of other risks that people don't think about what it can do. We talked about trick-or-treaters and where we live. We're on a septic system, so I just want to address with our listeners what could happen. We call it whataboutism, but I play a lot of whataboutism in the industry I'm in because. What if I don't fix this? What if I just ignore a roof leak or whatever? So trickling water, like I said, it's common for people, especially, I used to hear it all the time. People would say, I just have to open the cabinet doors underneath the kitchen sink, when it gets really cold. And I'd look at them and be like, why? And they'd say, well, the heat gets in there from the kitchen. Well, if you have to do that, then there's something going on in that outside wall that's causing the concerns. And when pipes do freeze up, any of our listeners that have dealt with that, you're in the dead of winter typically, and you have no water. And for the most part, you don't have someone that knows how to thaw those lines out. So it turns into quite a bit of a mess.
So what are the worst case scenarios if a family goes away for the weekend and they leave the water trickling? What could go wrong?
Well, the biggest thing to go wrong there is, let's just say for some reason it gets really cold and your drain lines freeze up, which theoretically it shouldn't because there's water always moving through it. But just take in consideration if that drain line backed up, where's all that water going to go?
What, back into the septic if they have it?
No, I'm saying the drain pipes themselves for the kitchen sink, if they freeze up, the water's going to fill those sinks up.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's not, we always talk about, and our listeners that have followed us for quite a while, usually around January, it was one of your first experiences with mold, and that was the job up in Shoshone, Wyoming. Remember that?
Oh, I remember that with the big icicles on the back.
There were icicles. For our listeners that don't know, what happened was the home was heated with radiant heat. So it was heated with water. It wasn't glycol or anything like that. It was all water on a boiler system. Well, the lines, the return lines came up into the attic and then down into the mechanical closet where the boiler was. It was a foreclosed home. Whoever winterized it didn't shut that valve off. And on top of that, you can't just shut valves off. You got to blow the lines out. But anyhow, middle of winter, it was, first part of January. On our way up there, I think it was, -30?
Yeah, it was freezing.
It was cold.
Freezing.
So anyhow, we get up there, and they obviously had the water shut off. But for our listeners, the reason why there were icicles from the eaves to the ground was because all that water was coming out those soffits. And I think I was told, and I can't remember for sure, but it's a tiny town. If anybody knows where Shoshone is, then you're probably a lot more familiar with Wyoming than most people are. But it's a tiny town, 150 people. But anyhow, the mayor was driving by, and water was literally running out of the front door.
Wow, that's terrible. So
yeah, that's an extreme excuse. That's not really water trickling, but yeah, it can wreak havoc. And that project, I believe, we typically don't always rehab them, but we did on that one just because it was so rural. And it was over $60,000 for everything. I mean, we had to pretty much gut the whole thing. Yeah. It was not a pretty sight.
So it can be very expensive for people who think just leaving the water trickling is okay, but it leads to other things happening.
Yeah, my point is my whole concern with leaving the water trickling is I would ask the question, if they were a client, first thing I would say is, why are you doing that? And if they say, well, once in a while it freezes up, and so that's why we're doing it. Well, I would, if I was on site, I'd get my infrared camera out and I'd figure out, well, is there a draft somewhere in a wall cavity? Is there, what's going on that's causing it? Because at the end of the day, we want to fix that. So it's no different than on the medical field. You got to stop the bleeding, figure out where the source is before you put stitches on it, or on it, in it, whatever you're dealing with.
So should people just not leave their water trickling if it's the dead of winter and they're going away for a week?
Yeah, I would. And what we do here is we just shut the wellhead off.
Okay.
But yeah, just shut the main valve off. You're better off just not worrying about it at all. The problem you run into with that, if you're on a septic system, if it was not installed below the frost level, so let's just say the frost level's here and the top of the tank's here, it can freeze. And so without any water coming into it, so there's no activity, no toilets are being flushed, no shower drains are going into this septic tank, that could freeze up too. So it's kind of a, and you could put a tank heater in there. There's ways around it, but if you have those kinds of issues, you probably need to call a specialist that knows what they're talking about. And, I guess my point is you should just shut your water off, but that could lead to other problems too.
That's very, very true. So in the case of a septic system, still you're saying bottom line is just shut the water off.
Right.
Don't leave the water trickling.
Exactly. And those of our listeners that have septic systems, it's a well-oiled machine. if you treat your septic tank properly every month with enzymes, you're not putting stuff that shouldn't be in the drains down that, feminine products, grease, stuff like that. If you treat it properly, your septic system, if it's healthy, it actually, and the whole point of enzymes is to break down the solids to liquids. Those liquids go out into your leach field and they should drain out there. Well, if you're pushing a bunch of water through that, the septic system or the tank itself cannot organically break down those solids. So it's, my point is if you're constantly running water, the health of your septic system's going to diminish quickly.
Okay. Which
could lead to too much, your leach field doesn't have the capacity for that amount of water or liquids. And so then it starts backing up. I mean, it's, you've seen it. Our listeners that have dealt with it, it's not fun when you no matter what it is, it's not fun to have a sewage backup. But on top of that, if you're having a mold issue because of a sewage backup, then you've got, as far as mitigation, there's just a lot more to it, and it's expensive.
Absolutely. So we're going to, you just mentioned mold, going to the mold issue. Where does mold fit into this leaving the water dripping versus shutting the water off? Where does mold come in all of this?
Well, so if you have just a minor leak, whether it could be, it could be a drain line, which shouldn't be happening, or a water supply line, once the humidity gets, so for our listeners, if you've listened to me long enough, this is why we have you on the podcast, because I just assume everybody knows how all this works. But for our listeners that know, there are three main components that you have to have for a mold infestation to become viable. So think of mold infestation viable like a flower growing and blooming. Mm-hmm. Non-viable, it kind of withers away. For mold, we say it goes into a dormant state. You have to have three things. The mold spores themselves, which you're never going to get rid of, unless you're in some lab that, has all this filtration equipment, surgery center, things like that. And even surgery centers aren't that high tech. So you're always going to have the mold spores. Then the humidity has to be over 60%. So for our listeners, I'm sure you can tell them where you always see humidity over 60%.
Oh, the shower.
The bathroom.
Bathroom.
Every time.
Yep.
So, and what do? You take preventative measures to make sure, because the fan
is on constantly, and the door is open after the shower is open.
So you get that drop down. If you were to wait, it only takes 48 hours for that to start reproducing. But the third main component you have to have is a food source.
Yeah.
So that would be, for the most part, porous cellulose materials. Concrete's not really a cellulose material. Wood, 2x4s, those are cellulose materials. It's not as porous as, let's say, sheetrock. So it's a lot tougher. My point is if you have sheetrock or insulation, that's a favorite thing that mold loves, because it's very porous. And whereas something like I said, a 2x4 in a wall, just think of that and how porous it is versus sheetrock and insulation. So you have the three main things: mold spores, humidity over 60%, and a food source. The food source and the humidity, pretty much the humidity has to be there over 48 hours. Once that happens, mold starts reproducing. And it's growing behind your walls. It's maybe in your crawl space, in your floor joist. It's happening where you're not really noticing it till you have a major issue.
And so really, if you're leaving the water trickling, you're opening up yourself to moisture intrusion events.
Exactly.
Which then leads to the combination of sheetrock or some other cellulose material getting wet, whether under the sink or around the sink. And then you add the humidity, and now you've got a mold problem.
Exactly. Okay. And it's, for the most part, a lot of people, like, let's just say there's some sort of roof leak. By the time you notice it, in the living area below it, you've noticed that there's usually sometimes a water stain that goes away or whatever. Well, then you start seeing that the paint starts bubbling and peeling, which is telling you there's more moisture. And then after that, like, it's a pinhole because the water has to follow the path of least resistance. Then all of a sudden you have water just shooting in. Mm-hmm. So, it's just something where over time people that's the biggest problem, I think, with mold. And I think it's similar with cars and homes in general and people in general. They ignore the little things until it becomes major. And when you're talking about mold, when it becomes major, not only is it on our side of it, the construction side, you have the health side of it too. You know, if you're sick all the time and you have to take whatever 6 weeks off of work or go on FEMLA, or you're going to the doctor all the time, you're doing blood work, you know, on the mold side for blood work, a lot of insurance companies won't cover that. So I guess my point is something that was easy, cheap, quick. It literally could have been just a consultation with the right person. It could save you thousands of dollars, whether it's in healthcare or it's your job or in mold mitigation.
That makes a lot of sense. So what is your call to action for people?
So like we were talking about when we first started this is, you know, a lot of people think if they open their cabinet doors that's going to help the pipes not freeze underneath their sink. But check underneath those cabinet doors. Check around your water heater, places that you just don't typically like to look. And you know how I am. So mold for our listeners it's very common to be in dust. And so a couple times a year, what do I do with the big shop vac?
Yeah, you go and remove all the dust.
I get the HEPA vac out and vacuum it. It's not a bad idea for our listeners to do the same thing. Just if you keep things somewhat tidy, you pay attention to what's really going on and just check for water stains or suspected mold.
Awesome. And that leads us to your latest book.
Yeah, it's been my latest book for, a year now? I'm slacking a little bit, and I know our listeners are like, when is he going to? I promise you, by February next year, I'll have at least one more out, hoping to have a couple more out. But Building a Mold-Resistant Home, that's black mold avoidance is what it's called, Building a Mold-Resistant Home. It goes through more of the contractor side of you know, how to build a home that, once again, is going to be mold-resistant, not mold-proof. Mm-hmm. We talked about last week about putting a plastic cover on a mattress. Just because you do that doesn't mean you can't get mold. Exactly.
So, and all you have to do is go to Amazon and type in black mold resistance, right?
Or my name.
Or Steve Worsley, and you will find all of the books there.
Or you can go to the website. There's a link there,
That's
sure,
right,
that we've created. And it's not hard to find them. If you just Google the mold epidemic, which I know we're not promoting that book, but it pulls me right up. I'm right at the top of the list. So,
absolutely.
Because our listeners are buying that book, so we thank all of you.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for buying. And again, cnccontractorservices.com. You can find about the books, the courses, everything else right there. We'll catch you on the next episode. Prevent toxic mold exposure before it gets in your home. Download Steve's free mold investigation checklist at tinyurl.com/CNC mold checklist. Again, download Steve's free mold investigation checklist at tinyurl.com/CNC mold checklist.